Father, thank you. Thank you for today. Thank you for the blessing and privilege of gathering together as brothers and sisters within this church. Lord, we just pray your blessing upon our time. Lord, that you would illuminate the mighty words that you've given to C.S. Lewis, Lord, and allow us to contemplate how they impact our lives and the lives of those around us. I pray this in your precious Son's name. Amen. All right, so we continue our journey on one of the best books of all time. I was trying to convince people. I was at a volleyball tournament, and I was selling them. I was giving out copies to people, telling them what a great book it is. It's so eye-opening. We are in chapter 10. We are continuing talking about Christian virtues. And chapter 10 involves the virtue of hope. Right? And so when I say the word hope, what comes to mind? What is hope? And don't be all theological, but what's the first thing that pops to mind? Yeah. That's good. Expectation. Okay, that's a good way. So what else? What else pops to mind when we say the word hope? Anticipation, right? So Lewis kind of starts the chapter by saying, we don't really grasp, most people don't grasp the idea and concept of hope, right? He said it's not just wishful thinking in our faith, almost like you go and buy a lottery ticket, and I hope I win these $10 million, right? That's a form of hope, certainly not Christian hope, though. And he also says that it's not the idea that, I'll sit here in my room and I'll wait for the Lord to return. I have a hope that Christ will return, right? And they sound silly examples, but truly, people that live their lives both ways, don't you, right? He said, no, it's something much different. He said, it's something that's transformative, right? It's something that grabs hold. His phrase is, their minds were occupied with heaven when he was talking about the mighty saints that have had such impact in the world. So here's another question for you. As I was reading and praying and preparing for this, I thought, how often during your average day do you really reflect upon heaven? Somebody says, every minute of every day. Liar, liar, pants on fire. But the fact that we are called, truly called, to live in this world with the lens of heaven in everything that we do is transformative, right? But we let it slip away. We let it slip away so often. And this is why, we believe in so much in the office, and everything that we do has these rhythms about them, right? Anglican rhythms, Christian rhythms of staying close to the Lord, of reading Scripture, of praying, right? Why is it, though, that even we Christians seem to lack so much in this important Christian virtue of hope? Well, it's because what does the world tell you, right? What does the world tell you about hope? Well, everything, right, is immediate. Everything is temporal. Everything is what we can touch, what we know, what we see here and now, right? Our entire educational system is really based upon that concept and that lens. And it becomes very difficult for us to see past that immediate, that temporal, the now, the tangible, right? And so, what's going on? Well, Lewis kind of alludes to what we've all talked about in different forms before. I've preached on it before. But it's the fact that there's this hole within you, right? Everybody has this hole. And you know what I mean? That there's something more that I should see or I should be receiving, I should be getting in life. Raise your hand if you've felt that before. Anybody ever felt that before? Yeah. And he says, right, that we start to realize it. And you think about all the different examples, the parrot heads. Any parrot heads that love Jimmy Buffett here, right? You like your motorcycles, whatever it might be. The gym people are always amazing. The people just ripped, and you're like, wow. And they've become completely focused, right, on filling that God-sized void with working out 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. Right? There's something not quite right, and they're never going to get there. They're never, ever going to get there. And that's what Lewis kind of brings us to, right? And he says, it's true even with all of the good stuff, even with that precious man or that woman sitting next to you right now, right? The idea of travel, learning, all these wonderful blessings that God gives to us in this world, that too often we try to take even those good things, we stuff them in the hole and say, okay, that should satisfy me. And what happens? It's not enough. It's not enough. And he says, there's basically two wrong ways of dealing with this void. And there's probably more, but I like these two that he pours out. Number one is what he calls the fool's way. And this is where you blame the thing itself that you're trying to fill the hole with, right? Everybody follow me? So talking about, whatever, your spouse, right? It's like, oh gosh, how did I end up married to this guy, right? Or how did I marry her, And she just doesn't give me what I thought she would, or she's not doing what she should do. So sadly today, right, what's the answer? Well, we find another, right? We leave our spouse, we run around, we find ourselves in pornography, whatever it might be, and we're constantly looking for something else, but it's always that object's fault that we've tried to fill the God hole with. And it doesn't work. And, he said basically like, this is the primary problem of the rich and discontented. And I thought about that for a minute. And I started thinking about the really rich people in like Hollywood and, all the people with, then I thought, wait a minute, this is actually like all of America, right? Not all of America, but it's pretty much us. You think about how spoiled rotten we are. And the access that we have to entertainment. I happened to have Netflix on as I was finishing this chapter, and it was like, there are literally tens of thousands of different programs, right? Kids don't call it that anymore. Shows, or is that what they call them, Porter? Shows? Okay, something like that. But that you can choose from. When you're not happy, you just go to something different. And that's the way that we tend to live our lives. Yeah. Tiger Woods. What Tiger Woods went through, right? Sure, that's a great example. But it's not just the famous and the celebrities. It's you and me. We do this. Guilty, guilty, guilty. And then I love the second one he brings out. I don't want to point fingers on this one, but I love the phrase. He says, "There's the way of the sensible, disillusioned man." Okay, that's only something that C.S. Lewis could say. The way of the sensible, disillusioned man. And this is his quote. He says, "Of course one feels all these wonderful things when you're young, but by the time you get to my age, you have given up on the chasing of the rainbow's end." In essence, this person, right, is somebody that sort of says, all that stuff is nice. I probably even used to have some of that, but now, well, I've gotten older, and I've learned to kind of live without it, and I'm fine as I am. And that sounds kind of, at first you're like, wow, that's very honorable, right? That somebody's kind of figured that out, right? Being happy with less. And he says the man kind of rubs along fairly comfortably because he has such a low expectation of life. Do you know anybody like this? Don't point fingers. Do you know anybody like this? And I was thinking about it too, but here's the question, by the way, he asked. He said, that sounds fine if life really ends at age 90, right? But what if life goes on? And I love Lewis continually points us to that. What if really there's a heaven? What if we're eternal beings? What if that's the way that God created us to be with him forevermore? And there you are sitting in your pew, right? Saying, well, it used to be good. Yeah, I used to do that. Well, not anymore, right? Come on, Jesus, come. And you've accepted that false brand of hope. I have a relative that's exactly like this, and somebody that I love and I really do appreciate so much. But the older this person has become, they've slowly given up on things. They've stopped going to their civic club, right? They stopped going out and doing the fishing. They stopped going out and they gave up thing after thing after thing. And in their mind, they can sort of justify and say, well, I'm just too old. It's changed. Things have transformed so quickly. And it's moved into this place now where there's absolutely no community, no Christian community around this person either. And it breaks my heart, right? That's not the kind of hope that we're living in. We're not going and sitting in our room. So Lewis says, but there's a third way, and this is the way that we're all called to live. And that is that we're to live the Christian virtue of hope. And it's basically the idea, look, if I find myself continually trying to fill the God hole with stuff, and it isn't working, right? And I've tried about everything that I know how to try, then what does that have to tell me? It has to tell me that there's something more. There's nothing on this earth that can fill the God hole, right? Yes. And so therefore, I have to begin to embrace, right, the truth of the gospel. That Christ came to give us life abundantly. And again, so often as Christians, the older we get, the more we find ourselves living into this sort of complacency of, yeah, and I can't wait till heaven comes. That's not the call of Christian hope. You see, it's active, and it looks different. There are people that can barely get out of bed right now, right? They're not going to be able to do the same things that you all can be doing in the faith. But we're all called, every breath that God gives us, that we're called to use it to glorify him here and now, right? That's an important thing. And once we realize this, right, what happens is this hope starts to become very real. It's a virtue that we practice, right? It's something that becomes part of who we are as Christians. And I always like reading a couple little excerpts each time. But on page 137, I thought, as we talk about heaven and as we focus on heaven, I thought Lewis was pretty interesting in what he says about it. He says, there's no need to be worried by people who try to make the Christian hope of heaven ridiculous by saying they do not want to spend eternity playing harps. The answer to such people is that if they cannot understand books written for grown-ups, they should not talk about them. All the scriptural imagery, harps, crowns, gold, is of course a merely symbolical attempt to express the inexpressible. Musical instruments are mentioned for many people, not all. Music is a thing that is present life, which most strongly suggests ecstasy and infinity. Crowns are mentioned to suggest the fact that those who are united with God in eternity share his splendor and power and joy. Gold is mentioned to suggest the timelessness of heaven. Gold does not rust, and the preciousness of it. People who take these symbols literally might as well think that when Christ told us to be like doves, he meant that we were to lay eggs. Love C.S. Lewis, right? But the point of all this is to say that heaven is something that exists. And it's not something that we sit and wait for. We are agents of God. We are called to usher heaven into this world right here and right now. And there's a joy about it. You heard Marcus preaching about it this morning. There is a great joy about being in the Father's business, right? And you know what I mean. And some of us, that's why I love this book, it's a little bit of kick in the pants. And you go, I don't know. Maybe I feel a little bit more into that camp 2 or that camp 1. The call is to move to camp 3, right? This joyous hope and expectation, right, of Christ. So good chapter. Any questions, comments, thoughts on chapter 10 with hope? Fantastic. So we move to another Christian virtue, a very important one, bless you, and a very difficult one. I like when I see really smart people, far smarter than me, wrestling with things, it always intrigues me. It always gives me encouragement, right? So Lewis, you can just tell when you read chapters 11 and chapters 12, I think he probably spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to convey the issue of faith, the Christian virtue of faith, right? And he begins by saying, in essence, there are sort of two types of faith, of Christian faith in terms of the virtues, right? Two different levels or two different sort of lens. But he also begins here and says, faith is not merely someone who accepts as true the doctrines of Christianity. Everybody hear me say that? That this is not the Christian virtue of faith, where you say, yes, I accept everything that we say in the Nicene Creed. Okay? It's important that you do that. That's orthodoxy. Well, that's really important. We say it every week. There's a reason we do that. But what he's saying to us is, it's not simply saying it's true. He said, because a virtue is not about knowledge, right? Really not even about belief, but it's about behavior. It's about taking those things and allowing them to become active, right, in who we are. And he says, the problem is the belief means accepting something as true, but there's no guarantee that they will keep believing it, especially when a reason to reconsider it turns up, okay? And so we have this battle constantly inside us, right? We have sort of this idea on one side of faith and rationality, things that we know, right? Things that the Lord has given us and shown us. But then we have these other things that can be really dangerous, right? Emotion and imagination, both which are God-given and can do wonderful things. But they also can wreak havoc, right, on what we know to be true. And so he gives us a couple examples. One example he provides is the idea of, I'm a guy, so I'm going to do it this way. You know that a woman, a beautiful, beautiful woman, right, that before marriage, et cetera, you know that she is a liar, you know that she's a gossip, you know that she's just very destructive in the way that she lives her life, okay? But then you have an opportunity to go out on a date with her, right? And she's the most beautiful girl you've ever seen. What happens is that our emotions tend to sweep us away. And we walk away from our knowledge, right? We know who she is, we know her character, but the fact now becomes, wow, she's interested in me, Tom? Like, okay, right? Okay. I bet she's not really the way that she, is. I've changed my mind slightly on her. Y'all follow that? That's a great example of how things start to change, right? We see emotions starting to kick in. He also gives the example of teaching people how to swim, okay? And I don't know if I've ever shared, I think I had in a sermon a couple years ago, but the way I put myself through college is I actually had a swimming school. Had the Krizner swimming school, believe it or not. And I found, as I taught hundreds and hundreds of people to swim, that the hardest people to teach were who? The children? Of course not. The adults, right? In fact, I always charged double because I knew it was going to be a nightmare trying to wrestle them in the pool. And we would sit before we ever get into the pool, and we'd talk. And I was almost like a little high school psychologist. But, tell me why you've never learned how to swim, right? Well, it's usually had some kind of bad incident when they were 5. They fell into a pool or whatnot. And then you broke open the science, and you explain how the human body, right, is actually capable, very designed to be able to float. And yep, absolutely. And we're all shaking hands and fist bumping, and it's going to be good. And as soon as we got into the pool, you could just see things change, right? I mean, the whole body would tense in the shallow end. And as we started to move more towards the middle, they would go into full panic. And even though their minds knew that their bodies were very capable of swimming, suddenly the fear kicked in, right? And Lewis says, so when we talk about this first version of faith, right, through a Christian lens, it's very, very similar. We know, right, things to be true. We know that the Bible is true. We know that Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. We know that. But as we enter into the world and we find ourselves challenged with situation after situation and opinion after opinion, what happens is our emotions sometimes take us away. And here's another quote that he says. He says, the rebellion of our moods against your real self is going to come anyway. That is why faith is such a necessary virtue. Unless you teach your moods, quote, where to get off, you can never be either a sound Christian or even a sound atheist, but just a creature dithering to and fro with its beliefs really dependent on the weather and the state of its digestion. Consequently, one must train the habit of faith. And he says right after that, he said, and don't most people simply drift away anyhow? I read that over and over again. I'm not going to get into deep theology and once saved, always saved, and lots of things that we can wrestle with separately. But it did strike me when I think about, that phrase was very popular, nominal Christianity. And what happens sometimes to people that are sitting in these pews right next to us every Sunday? And how critically important it is as a church body, right? For you to share your passion, your joy, your excitement about Jesus with the person next to you. Even so much to invite them to be part of something that you are doing within the life of this body. Well, Bill, you see the keys this morning? Like, it's 25 pages. There's lots of stuff. Tell them to figure it out. That's not what I'm saying. Do you know how many people come and their only encounter with Christ is this worship time on Sunday morning? There's something more for them, right? We don't want people to, quote unquote, fade away. And I hear all about the pandemic and all these numbers and studies showing that when the church comes back, it's going to be at 70%. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Because I believe in the power of Christ and I believe in the power of the church that we're not going to let that happen, right? That we're so on fire and we're so in love with Jesus that we want to reach out to other people, other brothers, other sisters, nominal Christians, I hate that phrase, but nominal Christians, and encourage them and invite them to be part of the life of the parish. It's critically important. It's not the priest's job. I do my best, I promise. I beg people to come out and do stuff. It's a lot more effective, though, when you invite them into your home. You invite them out to do whatever it is that you do in the church. So Lewis then talks about, he said, so many people, including Christians, kind of just flail along, right? And so the faith is never really tested. He said, so I want you to take a 6-week challenge. This is like one of those dietary things, right? Like, don't eat carbs for 6 weeks and see how you feel. But he says, for 6 weeks, he said, I want you to try practicing these Christian virtues that we're talking about, that I'm sharing with you, right? And he kind of makes the first point based on that, and he said, until you start to do that, you don't realize, how far gone you are, quote unquote. Like how far outside actively walking with Christ you are until you really delve in and you stay focused on living out Christian virtue. But then the best point he makes is the reason you should do it is after 6 weeks, you'll realize what a failure you are. and he said, and that's the key. Like, if you really want to understand the Christian virtue of faith, that's the place that you have to get, right? It's not this, somehow you're trying to pass this heavenly exam that God has set forth for you. Look at what a great Christian I am because I've mastered these virtues. No. What we see is the opposite. We see as we come faithfully trying and we're wrestling and we're struggling, we start to recognize what utter failures we are and that the grace of God is the best gift ever given. And so that's where he ends the first chapter on faith. And he does one last thing that I've always liked. I've seen this before. Maybe Lewis originated it. But he said, where you find yourself is sort of like a child who wants to celebrate his daddy's birthday. So what does the child do? The child goes up and says, Daddy, can you give me some money so I can buy you a birthday gift? And so the child goes out and buys the gift and gives it to the dad. The dad delights in the fact that the son loves him so much that he would give him a gift, right? But where did the gift come from? Well, from the father. See, the son couldn't give the father anything because the father was all the father's to begin with. And it's a simple little example that we've used with our children before, but it's an important one, right? That's what faith looks like. So he pivots then to chapter 12, the second chapter on faith, and sort of says, okay, so let's talk about the second lens of it. And there's kind of an overlap here. He said, I want to talk about faith in the second sense, what he calls the higher sense. He said, what God really cares about is that we should be creatures of a certain kind, right? We should be creatures of a certain kind or a certain quality that deeply relate to him, right? And that's very sort of mysterious when you say it that way. But we move away from this picture of God as the great examiner, trying to find all of our problems and our faults, etc., right? And we move more into relationship, being in the right spot with the Father. What he says is discovering the fact of our own bankruptcy. It's a horrible word, isn't it? Bankruptcy. God died for my sins, but he said, here's the deal. You can't just come to an intellectual understanding of that. Yes, I get it. I see it. I say it every Sunday. He said, in your failures, right, in your utter despair, you have to reach a point and a place where you say, I can't do it. Only you can do it, God. Only you can do it, Abba. Only you can do it, Daddy. And he said, and what happens is, people who are really pursuing Christian faith, the Christian virtue of faith, find that over and over and over again. And the more often that they proclaim that, right, and they say, I am helpless, and I can only do this with you, God, it builds that faith day after day after day after day. And he says, when somebody says, growing up, you don't stop sort of halfway and go, oh, I'm growing up right now. It's not just sort of this moment, this momentary realization. It's this constant, continual surrender that happens in the life of a dedicated Christian, right? And that virtue starts to become who you are in the way that you live your life and the way that you relate to others. He talks about sharing in the sonship. I've always liked that phrase too. That God calls us, right, to share in the sonship, to share in the life of Christ with him. We do not do things to be saved, but because he has saved us. And then he says, but back to hope, there's already a first faint gleam of heaven that's already inside you. Do y'all see that sometimes in your lives? Do you see that little glimpse of heaven? It's nothing of you at all. It's something that God has given to you. And you just experience something that's very different than what you've ever seen or known in the temporal world. This is where faith and hope kind of intersect. But the great mystery of Philippians 2, right, is where we ultimately end up with this idea of faith in this chapter. Paul says, therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And so you go, oh, you're wrong, Bill. See, look, he is the great examiner. Like, you better get it right. If you don't get that A+, right, you're not going to make it to heaven. But Lewis says, don't forget verse 13 that follows it, which is really the same sentence. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose, right? It's one of the most difficult things for Christians to understand and certainly to embrace. A man came up to me the other day at a ministry event that I was doing, a man that I've known a long time. And he said, I've been wrestling and wrestling and wrestling with this. He said, I just can't understand it. He said, you know, I read in the Bible that I'm called to be doing things and to be more. And he said, and I'm trying so hard to do those things. But I don't know, is it enough, Father Bill? Right? And explaining to him like the beauty of God's grace, this undeserved gift, and helping him understand that that hunger and that desire to be doing and engaged and living it out, like James talks to us about, right? The reason that happens is because you've been transformed. You're being transformed. You're being sanctified. You're growing in Jesus Christ. And so don't let your mind twist that around. And for him, that's really what it was. It was just bringing it back and saying, the reason you have this hunger and this desire and this movement, right, is because Christ died for you. He's called you into the heavenly army. You have opportunities now to be part of his kingdom work that you didn't have before. And that excitement and that enthusiasm is all good. That's a natural result of what's going on. The only analogy I can even think of, and it fails miserably, right? But it's just how, when we come into marriage. I had a long conversation with a daughter and a boyfriend the other day about this, right? But like, marital covenant is supposed to be a reflection of something heavenly, right? God is present in that. And when I become married, I surrender, right? I do it willingly, and my behavior changes because of that supernatural covenant that's now been created with my bride, right? It's failed because humans are failed, and we see it all the time. We treat it like a contract rather than a covenant. But that's an earthly example of where my life changes dramatically, and I act differently, right, because of a love relationship. The perfect one, of course, is only God. And so you can, again, you just see C.S. Lewis, he's penning this and whatever time it is at night and how many times he's rewritten it. And he gets to the bottom of 149. And like I said, this is what gives me encouragement when sometimes I reach my end, my intellectual end. And he says, it's such a mystery that he says, at any rate, it is as far as I can go. And that's it. And that's the end of the chapter on faith, right? So these are really good chapters. If you haven't read them, I know sometimes we get a little bit behind. I really want to encourage you all to go and pick them up and look at them a little bit deeper. Next week, we'll now transition out of book 3 into book 4. I would ask you to read chapters 1, 2, and 3. I'll send out an email on behalf of Michael and I for next week. But we're going to move into the doctrine of the Trinity next week. And since I've got 2 more minutes, just want to see, I always put this in the bottom of my handout, but the challenge is, are you living out that faith, right? Does that hope transform you? And my questions are, to which one of St. Peter's outward-facing ministries are you giving your time and your talents? If you need to know more about them, call me, right? I will drop whatever I'm doing and sit down with you, and I will help you plug in. There's so much going on. I just got a little update on the Wings of Change this morning, and these crazy ideas that are happening, unfolding, God-sized ideas. I love it, right? I love what's going on. Don't be that person who's sitting alone in their room waiting for heaven to come. Heaven is here now. God's calling you to the garden. He's calling you out to the work now. Where are you intentionally rooting yourself within the community, right? At my workplace. Gee, I go to the gym, Bill, wherever it is, but you're intentionally building relationships with people outside of our church, not the Anglican church, outside of the church, right? So that you have opportunities to proclaim the gospel, to share your faith with them. And the hardest one of all, I say, is who? There is somebody that God has before you right now, right? That is not in relationship with him. And he's asking you, he's prompting you, he's encouraging you to be more active in the way that you share the gospel, to be more boldly sharing the truth of Jesus. And by the way, it's about to be Holy Week. there's never been a better time, right, to be on fire for the Lord, to tell the people the good news of what's going on. So get excited. You're all called. We're all called to be evangelists. We're all called to be trumpeteers, to telling people about the truth of Jesus Christ throughout the entire world. Any questions before we wrap up? Thank you, guys. See you next week. God bless.